The year is 1991. Somewhere in the Iraqi desert, a column of Soviet-designed T-72 tanks rolls across the sand, their crews confident in their machines. These tanks had struck fear into NATO planners for decades. They were the backbone of the Warsaw Pact's armored might, designed to overwhelm Western Europe in a potential World War III. Their crews had been trained to believe they were invincible. Then, in the darkness of night, something impossible happened. Tank after tank in the column began exploding. Turrets flew into the air like bottle caps. Ammunition cooked off in massive fireballs. The Iraqi crews didn't even see what hit them. When they finally spotted their attackers on thermal imaging systems, they couldn't believe the range. 3,000 meters, nearly 2 miles away. It was a distance at which they thought themselves completely safe. The American M1 Abrams tank had just announced itself to the world in the most dramatic way possible. But this wasn't just a story about one battle. This was the culmination of 40 years of Cold War competition, innovation, and paranoia. This was about how two different philosophies of tank design, two different military doctrines, and two different economic systems produced machines that would finally meet in combat and settle a question that had haunted military planners since 1945. Who would win? The Soviet T-72 or the American M1 Abrams? To understand why Soviet tankers laughed at the Abrams, we need to go back to World War II and understand the Soviet approach to armored warfare. The Soviet Union learned brutal lessons about tank combat during the Great Patriotic War, as they called it. They learned that quantity had a quality all its own. They learned that simplicity meant reliability. They learned that a tank that could be mass-produced and maintained by conscripts in the field was worth more than a technically superior machine that spent half its time broken down. The T-34 medium tank exemplified this philosophy perfectly. It wasn't the most comfortable tank. It wasn't the most sophisticated, but it could be built in vast numbers, it could take punishment, and it could be repaired by soldiers with minimal training using hammers and wrenches. When the Germans invaded in 1941 with their technically superior panzers, it was the humble T-34 that ultimately prevailed through sheer numbers and reliability. This philosophy became doctrine. After the war, Soviet tank designers like Alexander Morozov continued this tradition. The T-54, introduced in 1947, was essentially a refined T-34 concept. Simple, robust, mass-producible. Then came the T-55 in 1958, an improved T-54. Then the T-62 in 1961. Each generation improved on the last, but the core philosophy remained the same. By the 1960s, the Soviets were looking ahead. NATO was developing new tanks with powerful guns and sophisticated fire control systems. The Soviets needed something that could counter these threats while remaining true to their design philosophy. The answer was the T-64, developed in Kharkov under Morozov's leadership. This tank introduced revolutionary features like an auto-loader, composite armor, and a 125mm smoothbore gun. But the T-64 had problems. It was complex. It was expensive. Its auto-loader occasionally malfunctioned in ways that were catastrophic for the crew. Most importantly, it violated the sacred principle of Soviet tank design. It couldn't be easily maintained by conscripts in the field. The Soviet military found itself in a dilemma. They needed the T-64's capabilities, but they also needed something simpler and more reliable. Enter the Ural Design Bureau and engineer Valery Venediktov. In 1967, they received orders to create a simpler, more reliable version of the T-64 that could be mass-produced and maintained under field conditions. The result was the T-72, which entered service in 1973. The T-72 took the best features of the T-64, simplified them, and packaged them in a tank that was cheaper to build and easier to maintain. It kept the 125mm gun and autoloader. It kept composite armor, but it used a simpler engine, simpler suspension, and simpler systems throughout. The Soviets were enormously proud of the T-72. On paper, it looked formidable. The 125mm smoothbore gun could fire armor-piercing, fin-stabilized, discarding sabot rounds at tremendous velocity. The composite armor, a sandwich of steel and ceramics, provided excellent protection against contemporary Western ammunition. The autoloader meant a crew of only 3 men instead of 4, making the tank smaller and harder to hit. And most importantly, it could be built in vast numbers at relatively low cost. By the late 1970s, T-72s were rolling off production lines not just in the Soviet Union, but in Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Yugoslavia. Export versions were sold to Soviet allies and client states around the world. Iraq, Syria, India, Libya, Algeria, and dozens of other nations bought T-72s. Soviet propaganda proclaimed it the finest tank in the world. Soviet tankers trained in these machines were told they were invincible. The Soviet military doctrine reinforced this confidence. Soviet armor doctrine called for mass tank assaults supported by artillery and air power. Individual tanks weren't expected to engage in long-range duels. They were supposed to overwhelm the enemy through sheer numbers and firepower, advancing rapidly and punching through enemy lines. The T-72 was designed for this role. It was small, fast, and deadly at typical combat ranges of 1,000 meters or less. When Soviet tankers heard about the American M1 Abrams in the early 1980s, they weren't impressed. Intelligence reports described a tank that was enormous, complex, and expensive. It used a gas turbine engine that guzzled fuel. It weighed over 60 tons, compared to the T-72's 41 tons. It cost over $4 million per unit, while a T-72 could be built for less than $500,000. To Soviet tankers, this seemed typical of American excess. The Americans were building a gold-plated monster that would break down in real combat conditions, while Soviet T-72s simply drove around them. There was another factor in Soviet confidence. They had never really tested their tanks against the best the West could offer under realistic conditions. In the various Middle Eastern wars, Soviet tanks had performed reasonably well, though often with mixed results. But Soviet analysts always blamed this on poor training of Arab crews, not on any deficiency in the tanks themselves. The T-72, they insisted, was a world beater that would dominate any battlefield. This confidence was about to be catastrophically tested. While the Soviets were perfecting their mass production philosophy, the Americans were grappling with a very different set of problems. The United States military emerged from World War II with a hodgepodge of tank designs and no clear vision for the future of armored warfare. The M48 Patton tank of the 1950s was adequate but not exceptional. The M60 tank, introduced in 1960, was essentially an upgraded M48. By the late 1960s, it was becoming clear that these tanks were outmatched by the latest Soviet designs. The Americans had a different military doctrine than the Soviets. American forces were smaller and couldn't rely on overwhelming numbers. Instead, they emphasized quality, training, and technological superiority. Each American tank and each American soldier needed to be more capable than their Soviet counterpart. This meant investing in superior optics, fire control systems, and crew training. It also meant that American tanks could be more complex and expensive because the military could afford to maintain them properly. In 1973, the United States and West Germany launched a joint project to develop a new main battle tank. The project was called MBT-70, and it was supposed to be a revolutionary leap forward in tank design. It featured a 152mm gun that could fire both conventional rounds and guided missiles, a hydropneumatic suspension, and numerous other advanced features. It was also a complete disaster. The project became so expensive and so plagued with technical problems that both countries abandoned it in 1971. The failure of MBT-70 left the U.S. Army in a difficult position. They desperately needed a new tank to counter Soviet armor, but they had nothing to show for years of development work and hundreds of millions of dollars. Congress was losing patience. Critics argued that the Army couldn't manage large weapons programs and suggested buying foreign designs instead. In 1973, the Army launched a new program called XM1 with a mandate to develop a new tank quickly and within budget. The program would be managed by General William Depew, who brought a different approach. Instead of trying to incorporate every possible advanced feature, the XM1 would focus on 4 key areas: firepower, protection, mobility, and crew survivability. Everything else was secondary. 2 companies competed for the contract: Chrysler Defense and General Motors. Both submitted designs that broke with previous American tank design philosophy. Most radically, both proposed using a gas turbine engine instead of a traditional diesel. Gas turbines offered tremendous power in a compact package, though they consumed fuel voraciously. The Army decided this was an acceptable trade-off for the mobility gains. Chrysler won the contract in 1976, and the tank was designated the M1 Abrams, named after General Creighton Abrams, a legendary World War II tank commander and former Army Chief of Staff. The first prototypes rolled out in 1978, and after extensive testing, production began in 1980. The M1 Abrams represented a fundamentally different approach to tank design than the T-72, where the T-72 prioritized simplicity and mass production. The Abrams prioritized crew effectiveness and survivability. Every system on the Abrams was designed to give the crew the best possible chance of seeing the enemy first, hitting the enemy first, and surviving if hit. The heart of the Abrams' effectiveness was its fire control system. This wasn't just a scope and a gun. This was an integrated system of computers, lasers, sensors, and stabilizers that turned tank gunnery from an art into a science. The gunner had a primary sight with day optics and a thermal imaging system that could see through darkness, smoke, and dust. A laser rangefinder instantly calculated the exact distance to target. A ballistic computer factored in range, ammunition type, barrel wear, wind, temperature, and the tank's own motion to calculate the perfect firing solution. Most incredibly, the gun and sights were independently stabilized. This meant the Abrams could fire accurately while moving at full speed over rough terrain. Previous tanks had to stop to shoot accurately. The Abrams could shoot on the move. This was a revolutionary capability that changed the fundamental dynamics of tank combat. The Abrams armor was equally revolutionary. Instead of steel plates or simple composite armor, it used a British-developed material called Chobham armor, named after the facility where it was developed. The exact composition was and remains highly classified, but involved multiple layers of different materials, including ceramics, designed to defeat both kinetic energy penetrators and shaped charge warheads. Chobham armor was dramatically more effective than the composite armor on the T-72, but it was also much bulkier and heavier. The gas turbine engine gave the Abrams extraordinary mobility despite its weight. The Honeywell AGT 1500 turbine produced 1,500 horsepower, giving the 60-ton tank a power-to-weight ratio better than many lighter tanks. The Abrams could accelerate from 0 to 20 miles per hour in 7 seconds. It could maintain 45 miles per hour on roads and 30 miles per hour cross-country. Its suspension system, borrowed from German designs, provided a smooth ride even at high speeds over rough terrain. Every aspect of the Abrams was designed with crew survivability in mind. The ammunition was stored in a separate compartment at the rear of the turret, isolated from the crew by heavy doors. If the ammunition was hit and exploded, blowout panels on the roof of the compartment would direct the explosion upward and away from the crew instead of into the crew compartment. The crew had advanced fire suppression systems, blast-protected seats, and spall liners to protect against fragments. American designers had studied every tank casualty report they could find and designed the Abrams to protect its crew from every known threat. But there were trade-offs. The Abrams was enormous compared to the T-72, making it a bigger target. It was vastly more expensive, limiting how many could be built. The gas turbine engine, while powerful, consumed fuel at an alarming rate. An Abrams could burn through 500 gallons of fuel in a day of heavy combat operations. This meant extensive logistics support. The Abrams also required more maintenance than simpler designs, though its systems were designed to be maintainable by trained crews in the field. When the first M1 Abrams tanks entered service with American armored units in 1980, NATO planners breathed a sigh of relief. Finally, they had a tank that could match Soviet armor on even terms. But could it really? On paper, both the T-72 and the Abrams looked formidable. Both had powerful guns, advanced armor, and good mobility. Intelligence analysts studied both designs and concluded that in a straight fight, the outcome would depend heavily on crew training, tactics, and the specific engagement conditions. There was one problem with all this analysis. It was all theoretical. The T-72 and the Abrams had never faced each other in combat. All the studies and war games in the world couldn't definitively answer the question of which was superior. The two tanks were products of completely different design philosophies, built by completely different industrial systems, intended for completely different military doctrines. Which approach was right? For 10 years, from 1980 to 1990, this question remained unanswered. The Cold War continued without the hot war that would have settled it. Then, in August 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait, and suddenly the theoretical was about to become very real. When Iraqi forces rolled into Kuwait on August 2nd, 1990, they did so with an army that was, on paper at least, extremely formidable. Iraq had the fourth largest army in the world, with over 50 divisions and more than 5,000 tanks. At the core of their armored forces were Soviet-designed T-72s, along with older T-55s and T-62s. Iraqi tankers had combat experience from the Iran-Iraq War, and they were dug into prepared defensive positions in Kuwait and southern Iraq. Saddam Hussein proclaimed that any attempt to dislodge his forces would result in the mother of all battles. The United States and a coalition of nations responded with Operation Desert Shield, a massive military buildup in Saudi Arabia. Among the first units to deploy were armored brigades equipped with M1A1 Abrams tanks. The M1A1 was an improved version of the original M1, featuring a German-designed 120mm smoothbore gun that was more powerful than the original 105mm gun. It also had improved armor, including depleted uranium mesh in the frontal armor, making it even more resistant to penetration. As American tankers prepared for the possibility of combat, they studied everything they could about the T-72. Intelligence analysts provided detailed briefings on the tank's capabilities and weaknesses. The T-72's 125mm gun was powerful and could threaten an Abrams at typical combat ranges. Its armor was good against older ammunition, but vulnerable to the latest American armor-piercing rounds. Its auto-loader was a potential weakness. If the ammunition carousel was hit, the results would be catastrophic. The T-72's fire control system was adequate, but not as sophisticated as the Abrams system, particularly at long range. The coalition spent months preparing. Crews trained relentlessly in the Saudi desert, learning to operate in the harsh conditions. Maintenance teams worked around the clock to keep the Abrams tanks operational despite the sand and heat. Logistics units stockpiled mountains of supplies, including the enormous quantities of fuel the gas turbine engines required. Everyone knew that when the fighting started, it would be intense. There was still uncertainty, though. How would the Abrams perform in actual combat? Would its complex systems hold up? Would its fuel consumption prove to be a fatal weakness? And most importantly, how would it fare against the T-72s in a direct engagement? Some analysts worried that the Abrams size would make it an easy target. Others worried about the Iraqi numerical advantage. A few even suggested that the Abrams might not be as superior as everyone hoped. The Iraqi forces, meanwhile, seemed confident. They had months to prepare defensive positions, digging in their tanks and creating kill zones. Iraqi officers had studied NATO doctrine and believed they understood how the Americans would attack. They planned to use their numerical superiority and prepared positions to inflict heavy casualties on any assault. Their T-72s would anchor the defense, engaging American armor at ranges where the Iraqis believed they could win. What the Iraqis didn't fully appreciate was how much warfare had changed since their last major conflict. They were preparing to fight a 1970s-style mechanized war, where success came from having more tanks and artillery in the right positions. They didn't understand that they were about to face a new kind of warfare, one where information, precision, and technological superiority could overcome numerical advantages. On February 24, 1991, the ground war began. Coalition forces launched a massive offensive into Iraq and Kuwait from multiple directions. The plan, conceived by General Norman Schwarzkopf and his staff, was brilliant in its simplicity. While Marines and Arab coalition forces attacked directly into Kuwait from the south, the main effort would come from the west. 7 Corps and 18 Airborne Corps would sweep deep into Iraq, then turn east to attack the Iraqi forces from behind, cutting off their retreat and destroying them in place. The 7 Corps included the 1st and 3rd Armored Divisions and the 1st Infantry Division, all equipped with M1A1 Abrams tanks. These divisions would be the tip of the spear, charging deep into Iraq to engage the Republican Guard divisions that were Iraq's best armored forces. This would be the test everyone had been waiting for. American Abrams tanks versus Soviet-designed T-72s in open desert warfare. The weather was terrible when the offensive began. A fierce storm brought rain, wind, and reduced visibility. But this actually worked to the coalition's advantage. The Abrams thermal imaging systems could see through the rain and dust, while Iraqi gunners struggled with their less sophisticated optics. Coalition forces advanced rapidly, overwhelming Iraqi border defenses. As American armor columns pushed north and east into Iraq, they began encountering Iraqi armored units. The first engagements revealed just how one-sided this battle would be. Iraqi tanks, often dug into defensive positions, opened fire on approaching American formations. In previous wars, this might have been effective. Dug-in tanks fighting from prepared positions with clear fields of fire had historically held significant advantages. But not this time. The Abrams crews could see Iraqi tanks on their thermal sights long before the Iraqis could see them. The thermal imaging showed hot Iraqi tanks as bright white signatures against the cooler desert background, visible at ranges of 3,000 meters or more. American gunners would acquire targets, lays them for range and fire, all in seconds. The 120mm depleted uranium penetrators would cross the distance faster than sound, hitting Iraqi tanks before their crews even knew they were under attack. Tank after tank exploded as American rounds punched through their armor and detonated the ammunition inside. The catastrophic ammunition explosions became a signature of these battles. The T-72's auto-loader kept its ammunition in a carousel beneath the turret, with the rounds arranged in a ring around the crew compartment. When an armor-piercing round penetrated this area, it would ignite the propellant charges stored there. The resulting explosion would blow the turret completely off the tank, sometimes hurling it dozens of meters into the air. Iraqi tankers who survived these initial engagements reported that they felt completely helpless. They couldn't see their attackers in the storm and dust. When they did finally spot American tanks and fired, their rounds often fell short or missed entirely because they had miscalculated the range. The T-72's fire control system required the gunner to manually estimate range or use a crude stadiometric rangefinder, both of which were far less accurate than the Abrams laser rangefinder. By the time Iraqi gunners corrected their aim, they were usually already dead. One particularly dramatic engagement occurred on February 26th during the Battle of 73 Easting, named after the map grid line where it took place. A squadron of the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, equipped with M1A1 Abrams tanks and M3 Bradley fighting vehicles, was conducting a reconnaissance in force when they stumbled into elements of the Iraqi Tawakalna Division, an elite Republican Guard unit equipped with T-72s and other armor. What followed was a one-sided slaughter. In a battle that lasted only a few hours, the American squadron destroyed approximately 80 Iraqi tanks, armored vehicles, and other targets without losing a single vehicle. The Abrams crews engaged Iraqi T-72s at ranges exceeding 3,000 meters, hitting them with first-round kills while moving at high speed across the desert. The Iraqis fired back, but rarely hit anything. When they did hit American vehicles, their rounds often failed to penetrate the Abrams armor. One Abrams tank, call sign Charlie 26, took a direct hit from a T-72's main gun at close range during this battle. The round struck the front slope armor and failed to penetrate. The impact was violent, shocking the crew, but the tank remained fully operational. The crew recovered, acquired the enemy tank, and destroyed it with a single return shot. This incident was repeated multiple times during the war. Abrams tanks absorbed hits that would have destroyed T-72s and kept fighting. The psychological effect on Iraqi forces was devastating. Soldiers reported feeling like they were fighting ghosts. Tanks would explode around them without warning. They would see flashes in the distance, but couldn't determine where they were coming from or how far away the enemy was. Iraqi commanders tried to organize counterattacks, but their formations were destroyed before they could close to effective range. Within days, organized Iraqi resistance began collapsing as units abandoned their positions and fled. The Battle of Medina Ridge on February 27th was perhaps the most dramatic engagement of the war. The 1st Armored Division attacked elements of the Iraqi Medina Division, another Republican Guard unit. In a battle that lasted less than 4 hours, American forces destroyed approximately 300 Iraqi armored vehicles, including dozens of T-72s, while suffering minimal casualties. The Abrams tanks engaged targets at ranges up to 4,000 meters, far beyond the effective range of Iraqi return fire. American crews described it as shooting fish in a barrel. Not a single Abrams tank was lost to enemy tank fire during the entire Gulf War. Several were damaged by mines, friendly fire incidents, and other causes, but no Abrams was penetrated and destroyed by an Iraqi T-72 or any other Iraqi tank. In contrast, coalition forces destroyed thousands of Iraqi tanks, including hundreds of T-72s. The kill ratio was so lopsided that it seemed almost unbelievable. The overwhelming American success in tank battles during the Gulf War shocked military analysts around the world. How could modern Soviet-designed tanks be defeated so completely? The answer wasn't simple and involved multiple factors that combined to create American dominance. First, and most importantly, was the fire control system. The Abrams' ability to hit targets at 3,000 meters or more while moving at speed was absolutely decisive. Iraqi tankers simply couldn't compete. Their fire control systems required them to be stationary to shoot accurately, and even then they struggled at long range. The Abrams crews could shoot accurately while moving at 40 miles per hour, something that seemed almost magical to observers. This meant American tanks could close rapidly while engaging targets, giving Iraqi forces no time to react or maneuver. The thermal imaging systems gave the Americans what amounted to night vision that worked day or night in any weather. During the storm that raged during much of the ground war, Iraqi forces were essentially blind. Abrams crews could see perfectly. Even in clear weather, the thermal sights could detect Iraqi tanks at ranges where visual identification was impossible. This meant American tanks always saw the enemy first, and in tank combat, seeing first usually means shooting first, and shooting first usually means winning. The superior training of American crews was another crucial factor. American tankers trained constantly, spending hundreds of hours each year in their tanks practicing gunnery, maneuvers, and tactics. They trained with their thermal sights in all conditions. They practiced rapid target acquisition and engagement. They rehearsed crew coordination until it was instinctive. Iraqi crews, while experienced from the Iran-Iraq War, hadn't trained to the same intensity and hadn't trained with the kind of technology they were facing. The ammunition used by the Abrams was also superior. The 120mm M829 depleted uranium penetrator could punch through the T-72s armor with relative ease. Depleted uranium is extremely dense and pyrophoric, meaning it can ignite on impact, causing additional damage. When these penetrators hit T-72 tanks, they would pierce the armor, enter the crew compartment or ammunition storage, and cause catastrophic kills. Iraqi ammunition, while capable of penetrating earlier American tanks, struggled against the Abrams advanced armor. The Abrams armor protection was far better than intelligence estimates had suggested. The combination of Chobham armor and depleted uranium mesh in the frontal arc made the tank nearly invulnerable to the Iraqi weapons facing it. The few T-72 hits that did strike Abrams tanks failed to penetrate in almost every case. This gave American crews tremendous confidence. They knew they could close with the enemy without fear. But there were also factors beyond the tanks themselves. American doctrine emphasized combined arms warfare, using tanks in coordination with infantry, artillery, and air power. Iraqi forces were often isolated and unsupported by the time they engaged American ground forces because coalition air power had spent weeks degrading Iraqi command and control, logistics, and support systems. American units had excellent reconnaissance and intelligence, knowing where Iraqi forces were positioned. Iraqi commanders often didn't know where American forces were until they were already under attack. The Americans also had much better logistics. Despite the Abrams' voracious fuel consumption, American logistics units kept the tanks supplied and operational. Iraqi forces, by contrast, were suffering from supply shortages after weeks of air bombardment. Many Iraqi tanks were short of fuel and ammunition when the ground war began. Some weren't even operational due to lack of spare parts or maintenance. It's also important to note that the specific T-72 variants Iraq possessed were export models with downgraded armor and fire control systems compared to the versions the Soviet military used for itself. The Soviets sold their allies and clients simplified versions with less capable systems. Whether the Soviet domestic T-72 variants would have performed better is impossible to say for certain, but they would certainly have been more capable than the Iraqi versions. The psychological factor shouldn't be underestimated either. Iraqi morale collapsed early in the war after weeks of punishing air attacks and the realization that they couldn't fight back effectively against American technology. Many Iraqi soldiers simply abandoned their positions when ground forces approached. Even the elite Republican Guard units showed limited will to fight after experiencing the one-sided nature of the combat. Some Soviet military observers try to argue that the poor showing of the T-72 was due to Iraqi incompetence rather than any deficiency in the tank itself. There's some truth to this. Iraqi maintenance was poor, their training was inadequate, and their tactics were sometimes baffling. But even accounting for these factors, the technological gap was real and significant. A better trained and better supported force operating T-72s would certainly have performed better, but they still would have faced severe disadvantages against the Abrams. The Gulf War revealed that a new era of warfare had arrived. Precision, information dominance, and technological superiority could overcome numerical advantages and prepare defenses. The Soviets had designed the T-72 for a different kind of war, one based on mass and momentum. That style of warfare was becoming obsolete, though many militaries wouldn't fully accept this lesson for years to come. The destruction of Iraq's T-72 fleet had immediate and far-reaching consequences. For the Soviet Union, already in its death throes in 1991, the results were devastating. For decades, Soviet weapons exports had been a source of both revenue and influence. Nations bought Soviet tanks, aircraft, and missiles because they were affordable and supposedly nearly as good as Western equivalents. The Gulf War shattered this perception. Overnight, the T-72 went from being considered a formidable main battle tank to being seen as target practice for Western armor. Countries that had invested heavily in Soviet equipment began questioning their choices. Some nations accelerated programs to acquire Western tanks or to upgrade their existing Soviet designs. The myth of Soviet military technological parity with the West was exposed as propaganda. The Russian military, successor to the Soviet armed forces, had to grapple with the reality that their tank designs were a generation behind. For the United States and its allies, the Gulf War validated the enormous investments made in the Abrams and other advanced weapon systems. Critics who had complained about cost overruns and questioned whether such sophisticated weapons were necessary were silenced. The Abrams had proven itself in the most decisive way possible. Orders for new tanks increased, and the Abrams went on to serve as the backbone of American armored forces for decades to come. The lessons learned from the Gulf War influenced tank design and doctrine worldwide. Every military with armored forces studied what had happened and drew conclusions. The importance of thermal imaging, laser rangefinding, and stabilized guns became obvious. The value of crew protection and survivability was reinforced. The concept of fighting from beyond the enemy's effective range became central to modern armor doctrine. For tank designers, the Gulf War provided hard data about what worked and what didn't. The Russians went back to the drawing board, developing improved versions of their tanks with better fire control systems, better armor, and better crew protection. The T-90, introduced in 1992, incorporated many lessons from the Gulf War. Later Russian designs, like the T-14 Armata, represent even more radical departures from the old Soviet design philosophy, emphasizing crew survivability and advanced systems. The Abrams continued to evolve as well. The M1A2 variant introduced in 1992 featured an improved commander's sight, better computers, and data link capabilities, allowing tanks to share information with each other and with headquarters. Later versions added improved armor packages, better ammunition, and various upgrades to keep the tank competitive against new threats. As of 2025, the Abrams remains in frontline service with the U.S. military and has been exported to several allied nations. The tank saw combat again in the 2003 invasion of Iraq and subsequent occupation. While the Abrams performed well, these conflicts also revealed vulnerabilities. Urban combat exposed the tank's relatively thin side and rear armor to rocket-propelled grenades and improvised explosive devices. Several Abrams tanks were lost to such threats, though the crew survival rate remained high thanks to the tank's protective features. These experiences led to the development of additional armor packages and active protection systems. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine that began in 2022 has provided another real-world test of modern armored warfare. Ukrainian forces have employed various anti-tank weapons, including Western-supplied systems, against Russian tanks descended from the same design lineage as the T-72. The results have shown that while tank design has evolved significantly since 1991, well-trained infantry with modern anti-tank weapons remain a serious threat to any armored vehicle. The dream of an invulnerable tank remains just that, a dream. But in the specific context of the Gulf War and the question that sparked this story, the verdict was clear. The Soviet tankers who laughed at the M1 Abrams learned a harsh lesson. The American tank, with all its complexity and expense, proved devastatingly superior in actual combat. The T-72 crews never had a chance to laugh once the shooting started. Most never even saw what killed them. The story of the Abrams versus the T-72 is ultimately a story about different philosophies of warfare and different approaches to military technology. The Soviets believed in mass, simplicity, and overwhelming force. They designed tanks that could be built in vast numbers and operated by conscripts with minimal training. This philosophy had served them well in World War II and seemed vindicated by their victories in that conflict. The Americans believed in quality, training, and technological superiority. They designed tanks that were expensive and complex, but gave their crews every possible advantage. They invested heavily in training and support systems. They accepted that they couldn't match Soviet numbers and instead focused on making each of their tanks and soldiers more effective. For decades during the Cold War, it was impossible to say definitively which approach was correct. War games and studies produced conflicting results. Analysts argued endlessly about the relative merits of different systems. The two approaches represented not just different military doctrines, but different economic systems and different political philosophies. In a very real sense, the question of which tank was better was also a question of which system was better, Soviet communism or American capitalism. The Gulf War answered that question, at least in the realm of armored warfare. The American approach worked. Quality, training, and technology defeated quantity and simplicity. The Abrams was superior to the T-72 in almost every meaningful way, and the results on the battlefield proved it beyond any doubt. But there's an important caveat to this conclusion. The Gulf War was fought on terms that heavily favored the American approach. The flat, open deserts of Iraq and Kuwait were ideal terrain for long-range gunnery and maneuver warfare. The coalition had air superiority from the first day of the war. American logistics were superb. Iraqi forces were poorly trained, poorly supported, and demoralized. In different circumstances with different terrain, different support, and different opponents, the results might have been less one-sided. Modern Russia has learned from the Gulf War and has significantly improved its tank designs and doctrine. The Chinese military, watching from the sidelines, drew its own lessons and developed its own advanced tank designs. The nature of armored warfare continues to evolve, with new threats from drones, guided missiles, and other technologies. The era of tanks as the dominant force on the battlefield may be ending, replaced by more distributed and diverse approaches to ground combat. But in February 1991, in the deserts of Iraq and Kuwait, the debate was settled. When the M1 Abrams finally met the T-72 in combat, it destroyed it utterly and without mercy. The Soviet tankers who had laughed at the American tank didn't laugh for long. 3,000 meters turned out to be a very short distance indeed when facing an opponent who could see you clearly and shoot with perfect accuracy while you remained blind and helpless. The Abrams had proven its worth in the most definitive test possible, actual combat against the very enemy it had been designed to fight. For the American tank crews who fought in that war, there was a deep satisfaction in knowing that their training, their technology, and their tactics had been vindicated. They had gone into battle in machines that their country had spent billions of dollars and years of effort to develop, and those machines had performed exactly as promised. The Gulf War marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. It was perhaps the last great conventional mechanized war of the 20th century and the First War.